Canada has just been shaken to its core. The Western provinces didn't just threaten, they officially announced a deal that could tear the country apart. Imagine a nation once seen as unbreakable, now standing on the edge of collapse. What drove them to this point? What deep wounds and forgotten struggles fueled this shocking move? And most importantly, what happens to Canada next? In the quiet halls of history, there are moments that thunder louder than war itself. Today, the Western provinces have spoken, and their voices echo with the weight of destiny. What was once only whispered in frustration is now carved into the stone of reality. Canada stands at a crossroads, and the world watches as the crossroads, and the world watches as the West declares its intent to break free. This is not just politics. This is the story of power, identity, and the future of a nation. When the announcement came, it did not arrive with fireworks or celebration, but with a heavy silence that seemed to grip the air across Canada. The Western provinces, long simmering with frustration, had finally stepped forward with an official declaration that many thought would never truly happen. WEXIT, once dismissed as a fringe movement or an angry slogan tossed around by voices ignored, had now been etched into reality by leaders who had decided that enough was enough. The shock was not in the whispers, not in the threats, but in the clarity of the words placed before the nation. It was no longer an idea, it was action. It was official. And in that instant, the very ground beneath the Canadian politics seemed to shake. The shockwave rippled first through the prairies where people gathered in small towns around kitchen tables, in cafes and grain elevators, staring at their phones and television screens in disbelief. Some cheered, their fists pounding the tables with pride. Others sat in silence, their minds caught between fear and relief, knowing that what had been set in motion could not easily be undone. From Saskatchewan to Alberta, from Manitoba stretching into the far reaches of Western identity, the voices of the people echoed. It has begun. The shock was not just in the announcement itself, but in the timing, the boldness, the defiance. Canada, a nation celebrated for compromise, had now seen its careful balance broken. Across the east, in Ottawa, in Toronto, in Quebec City, the declaration landed like a hammer. Politicians scrambled, phones rang endlessly, advisors whispered into the ears of leaders who looked pale with concern. The press erupted with headlines, flashing red banners across screens. The West declares separation intent. The sheer audacity of it rattled the corridors of power, where many believed the West would never follow through. They thought it was only frustration, that anger would fade with time, with promises, with subsidies. But they underestimated the resolve. They underestimated the years of feeling ignored, dismissed, and pushed aside. And now their shock was painted across their faces as they realized the depth of the wound. In living rooms across Canada, ordinary citizens tried to make sense of it. Families divided by geography and loyalty felt the weight of history pressing down. A father in Alberta told his son that this was the fight they had been waiting for, while a mother in Ontario whispered in fear about a country coming apart. The shock became deeply personal as Canadians wrestled with questions they had never thought they would face. What does it mean to be Canadian if the nation itself begins to fracture? What happens to the identity that has been carefully crafted for generations? The declaration was not just political, it was emotional. It tore at the fabric of belonging, forcing millions to rethink the very idea of unity. The shock was magnified by the sheer speed of the declaration. No drawn-out negotiations, no months of gentle persuasion. It was swift, almost ruthless in its delivery. Leaders of the western provinces had chosen to strike while the country was wary, while trust was low, while economic tensions still gripped the land. And in doing so, they ensured that the impact would not be diluted by distractions. It was a masterstroke of timing, catching not just the nation, but the world off guard. For as Canada reeled, foreign observers raised their eyebrows. A country long seen as stable, unshakable, and polite was now showing cracks that mirrored the great fractures of history elsewhere. The shock spread far beyond its borders, casting doubt on the image of Canada as the quiet, steady nation it had always appeared to be. Every great shift in history is marked by a moment when silence becomes impossible. The WEXIT Declaration was that moment. It was a declaration forged from years of resentment, of feeling unheard, of watching decisions made thousands of miles away dictate the lives of people in the West. The shock was not only in what was said, but in what it revealed. A truth long buried under the surface, a truth that could no longer be ignored. Canada was no longer standing on steady ground. It was teetering on the edge of something larger, something deeper, something that no speech from Ottawa could simply erase. The shocking WEXIT Declaration was more than a political move. It was a cry from a region that had found its breaking point. It was the unveiling of a storm that had gathered in silence for too long, now crashing into the open with unstoppable force. And as the echoes of that announcement spread from the oil sands to the Atlantic shore, from farm fields to city towers, one truth became clear. Canada had been shaken awake. It did not begin with a single announcement, nor with one politician raising their voice. The discontent of the western provinces is a story written over decades, whispered through generations, and carried in the dust of the prairies and the roar of the oil field. It is the sound of farmers watching their grain sold at unfair prices, of workers watching the wealth of their land drained to fuel cities thousands of miles away. It is the silence of communities that felt ignored by the very government meant to represent them. These roots run deep, deeper than any single election or policy, stretching back to the very foundation of the Canadian Federation. The West has always felt like a partner forced into a deal it never fully agreed to. The policies crafted in Ottawa often seem designed not for the people in Saskatchewan or Alberta, but for the interests of those living in Toronto, Montreal, and beyond. Equalization payments, carbon taxes, restrictions on pipelines. These were not simply policy decisions. To many in the West, they were daily reminders that their voices carried less weight, that their contribution to the nation was undervalued, that their sacrifice was taken for granted. The roots of this discontent were watered by every promise broken, every project stalled, every speech that spoke of unity but delivered exclusion. Generations of Western Canadians grew up watching their resources leave their borders while the benefits flowed elsewhere. They saw jobs vanish when industries were slowed by political decisions. They watched as environmental regulations were written in distant cities with little regard for the lives of those who lived among the oil rigs, the cattle ranchers, the endless fields of wheat. The disconnect was not just economic, it was cultural, emotional, almost spiritual. The West felt not like an equal partner, but like a province chained to a system that refused to understand it. And with every passing year, the divide grew sharper. In Alberta, families remembered the National Energy Program of the 1980s, a wound that never fully healed. In Saskatchewan, Farmers spoke of federal policies that left them struggling while others prospered. These memories, passed down through families, became part of the Western identity. They became stories told at supper tables, in union halls and schools, stories of being left behind, stories of being used, stories of being dismissed when they cried out for fairness. These stories hardened into beliefs, and those beliefs became the roots of a discontent that no politician could easily erase. It was not only about money, it was about respect, it was about recognition, it was about dignity. The people of the West wanted to be heard, not just managed. They wanted their sacrifices acknowledged, their industries respected, their way of life valued as much as the culture of the East. Yet time and again, they felt the weight of decisions that did not include them. The frustration grew, turning into anger, turning into resentment, until it became something unmovable, something that no short-term policy shift could soothe. When voices in the West first began to murmur about WEXIT, many dismissed it as nothing more than noise, a bargaining chip, a bluff. But those whispers were born from roots planted long ago, roots that had been fed by decades of neglect and watered with disappointment. This was not the anger of a moment, it was the anger of history, the anger of fathers and mothers who told their children that no matter how much they gave, it would never be enough for Ottawa. The deep roots of Western discontent cannot be traced to one day, one law, one prime minister. They are scattered across decades, stitched into the very soil of the land itself. They grow with every train that carries resources eastward, with every tax levied against an industry that fuels the nation, with every voice ignored in Parliament. And because those roots run so deep, they have given birth to a movement that is not so easily dismissed. They explain why the West stands today not with hesitation, but with certainty, demanding a future shaped by its own hand, rather than one imposed from afar. The declaration from the West did not remain contained within provincial borders. Like a stone cast into a still lake, the ripples spread outward, touching every corner of Canada, each wave carrying with it the weight of uncertainty and the sting of division. What had once been spoken of as unthinkable was suddenly very real, and the shock was not confined to Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. It was felt in Ontario's bustling cities, in Quebec's proud heart, in the Maritimes where tradition runs deep, and even in the territories where isolation has long shaped identity. The idea of Canada, once held as steady and unbreakable, now trembled beneath the force of those ripples. And in Ottawa, the ripple was immediate and brutal. Leaders who had long relied on the balance of federation watched in disbelief as the pillars of unity began to shake. Cabinet meetings grew tense, debates turned fiery, and the air grew heavy with panic. Political parties scrambled, some calling for reconciliation, others seizing the moment to stoke division for their own gain. The ripple was not only political, but deeply personal for those who had sworn to defend the unity of the nation. Every lawmaker, every strategist, every minister now knew they were facing not just a challenge, but an existential crisis. In Ontario, the ripple carried a different weight. The economic engine of the country suddenly realized that the fuel driving its industries was under threat. If the West truly walked away, what would happen to energy security, to trade, to the lifeblood of factories and businesses? Families who once paid little attention to politics now sat around dinner tables asking questions they had never considered. Would the cost of living rise? Would jobs vanish? Would their own futures be caught in the unraveling of the Federation? Fear crept into conversations. and uncertainty spread like wildfire. Quebec, with its long history of sovereignty debates, watched with a mix of fascination and unease. For decades, Quebec had been the province pushing hardest for independence, the one whose referendums had nearly torn the country apart. Now, with the West stepping forward, the dynamic shifted. Some in Quebec saw opportunity, a validation of their own long-standing frustrations with Ottawa. Others worried that if the West walked away, Quebec's leverage would vanish, leaving them stranded in a fractured federation. The ripple here stirred old wounds, rekindled debates, and forced Quebecers to reconsider their place in a Canada that might not survive the storm. Maritimes, often dependent on federal support, felt the ripple as a chill in the air. Small provinces that had leaned on equalization payments suddenly questioned whether the wealth of the West would still flow eastward. Without that support, what would remain of their fragile economies? Communities that had always felt distant from the power centers of the country now feared being left adrift, abandoned in the chaos of a splintering nation. The ripple for them was not only political, but existential, threatening the very survival of their way of life. Even in the North, the territories that often exist beyond the spotlight, the ripple could not be ignored. The Arctic, rich in resources and strategic importance, suddenly loomed larger in the minds of both politicians and citizens. If the Federation faltered, who would lay claim to the North? Who would protect it? Who would invest in its future? The ripple reached the frozen tundra, carrying with it a question no one had dared to ask before. What happens to the North if the South no longer stands united? The ripple effect was not only about politics or economics, it was about identity. For generations, Canadians had taken comfort in the idea that despite their vast differences, they were bound by something greater than geography. They were a nation stitched together by compromise, by shared sacrifice, by a belief in unity. But with the West's declaration, that fabric began to fray. People across the country looked at the flag, the anthem, the stories of their grandparents, and wondered if it was all about to unravel. The ripple carried doubt into the hearts of millions, eroding the quiet confidence that had long defined Canada's place in the world. The ripple effect across Canada's unity was more than political tremors. It was a shaking of the very soul of the nation. From east to west, north to south, Canadians were forced to confront the fragility of the country they thought was indestructible. And as each ripple spread, the question grew louder, more urgent, impossible to ignore. What if Canada, the land of compromise and peace, was never as unbreakable as it seemed? The future now feels like a fragile thread, stretched tight, swaying under the weight of uncertainty. Canada, once seen as steady, as unshakable, now stands on the edge of a divide that could define generations to come. With the West declaring its intent to break away, the nation does not face a simple political dispute. It faces a test of survival, of identity, of whether the bonds that once held it together can withstand the strain of resentment and fracture. The future is no longer written in steady lines. It hangs in the balance, trembling between unity and separation, between stability and chaos. For the West, the vision of the future has shifted. No longer do many dream of waiting for recognition from Ottawa. Instead, they dream of independence, of forging a new path shaped by their own decisions, their own industries, their own culture. For them, the future is painted in bold strokes: control over resources, control over taxation, control over destiny. Yet even as this dream burns bright, shadows creep along its edges. What would independence truly mean for trade, for security, for international recognition? Would freedom bring prosperity or isolation? The future remains uncertain, suspended in the air like a question no one dares to answer fully. In Ottawa, the halls of power echo with unease. Leaders know that every decision from this point forward could tip the scales. Concessions may calm tempers, but they may also embolden others. Firm resistance may project strength, but it may just as easily push the West further away. The nation's leaders walk a tightrope, balancing above a chasm, aware that one misstep could send the entire federation tumbling. The future is not theirs alone to decide, but their choices will shape the path that follows, for better or for worse. For ordinary Canadians, the balance feels even more personal. Families in Alberta wonder if their children will grow up in a country called Canada, or in a nation born from separation. Families in Ontario wonder if their economy can survive without the resources of the West. Families in Quebec watch closely, weighing their own long history of discontent against the possibility of a fractured nation. Across dinner tables and classrooms and workplaces, people are asking questions they never thought they would face. What does it mean to be Canadian if the country itself no longer exists as it once was? The international stage, too, watches with sharp eyes. Allies question whether Canada will remain the reliable partner it has always been. Markets hesitate, unsure of the stability of investments tied to Canadian unity. Rivals see opportunity, sensing weakness in a nation that once carried itself with quiet strength. The future hanging in the balance is not just domestic, it is global, with consequences that ripple far beyond the Rockies or the Ottawa River. And yet, in the midst of all this uncertainty, one truth emerges. The choices made now will define the future of the country in ways no law or policy ever has before. The people of the West must decide if their frustration outweighs the bond of unity. The people of the East must decide if they will listen, if they will bend, if they will finally recognize the depth of Western anger. The leaders of Canada must decide if they will protect unity with compromise or with defiance. Every choice carries weight. Every path leads to a different tomorrow. A future hanging in the balance is not simply about borders or treaties. It is about identity, belonging, and survival. The story of Canada now teeters on the edge. The next chapter unwritten, the pen held by millions of hands. It is a moment where history leans forward, waiting to see if this country will fracture and scatter into pieces, or if it will find within itself the strength to endure. The balance is delicate, the outcome uncertain, and the world waits to see which way the scales will fall.